This is the wreck of the Peter Iredale, perhaps one of the most iconic and photographed visible shipwrecks in North America. But few people know the background of this ship, her harsh crew conditions, or the story of her grounding here on Clatsop Beach nearly 120 years ago. We'll take a detailed look at her career and see how the wreckage changed over time, and then we'll head over to the Columbia River Maritime Museum and see what artifacts from the wreck still remain. All the while, we'll be revealing the seldom told backstory of this Northwest maritime landmark. The story of the Peter Iredale begins with a man named Peter Iredale. Peter was born near Maryport, England in 1823. At a young age, he went to sea as a sailor, working his way up the command until becoming qualified as a ship's master. Peter's skills were not limited to seafaring. He acted as a business agent and tradesman in West Africa for 6 years, where rumors persist that he even dabbled in some illegal trading and contraband. Regardless, he became a clever businessman with capital to invest, and he began investing in shipping, forming Peter Iredale and Company around 1868. His ships traded around the world, hauling any sort of cargo that was in demand. His company was restructured when he went into business with his son around 1881, changing the company to Peter Iredale and Son. But he had a falling out with him and found a new business partner named John Porter around 1890, restructuring again and changing the company name to Peter Iredale and Porter Limited. With each incarnation of his enterprise, he commissioned new vessels for his trade, usually owning the majority share in each of them. Over the years, his fleet grew and grew. The fleet included the Peter Iredale, the Ada Iredale, the Lizzie Iredale, the Lizzie Bell, the Dimsdale, the Davonby again, the Lodore, the Lonsdale, the Lorton, and the Vale of Doon. The bark Peter Iredale, although it was his namesake, was not his biggest, nor his fastest. It wasn't his first or his last, but it was arguably the most famous. Several of his vessels wrecked over the years, but the simple popularity of this wreckage and the exposure in photographs throughout the centuries since have made it stand out among the rest of his fleet. Like her namesake, the Peter Iredale was made in Maryport, England, and unlike her namesake, was around 2,000 gross registered tons. Built by R. Ritson and Company in 1890 for his final partnership, the Peter Iredale and Porter Limited. Like on most sailing vessels, her captain was afforded as much luxury as possible. This beautiful hand-carved wooden sideboard was salvaged from the wreck of the Peter Iredale and is now on display in the Columbia River Maritime Museum's Shipwreck Gallery. No doubt this originated in the captain's cabin. Also likely coming from the captain's cabin is this comfortable upholstered chair in the museum's storage facility. While Peter Iredale's fleet traded around the world, it had a close relationship with Portland and Astoria, Oregon. The Peter Iredale Company's ships frequently sailed to and from those ports. In fact, so much so that Mr. Iredale named one of his ships the Astoria. Early in her career, probably right from her initial launching, the Peter Iredale's hull was painted black. We see that in this painting at the Columbia River Maritime Museum, and we see that most of her fleetmates had the same paint scheme. The career of the Peter Iredale was mostly uneventful. No major accidents worth reporting. Her core crew were almost always Englishmen, but the rest of her hands, especially when sailing in and out of Oregon, was made up of a mixed bag of reluctant sailors of many nationalities, forced into the crew of the Peter Iredale against their will. The life of a sailor was a rough one. You worked nearly constantly, in harsh conditions for low pay. Well, as a result, finding men who were willing to be low-level sailors was a challenge for centuries. The practice of press-ganging or shanghaiing became common, even here in the remote seafaring communities of northern Oregon. A con artist named Larry Sullivan made a living off of this practice, drugging or kidnapping men and selling them into the crew of sailing ships along Oregon's Columbia River. And a frequent client of his was the captain of the Peter Iredale. These prisoners were simply men who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Travelers, farmers, townsfolk, but rarely professional sailors. You see, it was actually illegal, once a sailor had signed up for a voyage, to leave the ship until that voyage was completed. The fact that the signature on the registry was more often than not forged was totally irrelevant. So they were brought to the ship, signed on against their will, and legally couldn't leave. They had no means of notifying their family and loved ones, and if something happened to them while they were at sea or something happened to the ship, they were out of luck, and the family likely never found out. Payment to Sullivan would have been made, and in the middle of the night just before departure, his henchmen would row the unconscious crew out to the Peter Iredale, usually supplying them with about 30 crewmen, and they were locked in the ship's forecastle until the vessel was ready to leave, with Sullivan providing a couple of armed guards just in case anyone woke up too early. Jumping forward to today, the ship's forecastle is the last piece of the ship that still resembles her original structure. It's inside this very section of the vessel that these poor men were trapped while they recovered from their attack and realized that they were prisoners for the next few months. Once the ship was at sea, the men were released from this prison. And if they stepped out of line, they were beaten harshly by the officers of the Peter Iredale until they were willing to learn their duties and carry them out obediently. The Columbia River Maritime Museum even has a pair of the ship's handcuffs prominently on display. These were recovered from the wreck and would have been used in any event the captain deemed necessary.
Captain on board these ships was the ultimate authority and the law, and sometimes the rules and the laws had to be enforced, and so manacles were available. They also carried sidearms, or had sidearms available to enforce discipline on the ship.
Now, these kidnapped crewmen were paid, but only kind of. Every expense was deducted from their pay, and in fact, towards the end, occasionally, they often owed the ship money, and they better pay. With a crew of over 30, most of whom pressed into service and ultimately new to the sea, the Peter Iredale made its way from Portland, Oregon, around Cape Horn, up across the Atlantic, and home to England. Unfortunately, I can't say that this practice was uncommon. Sullivan made a fortune in blood money doing this, but the Peter Iredale was only one of hundreds of ships to hire him for his services. Sullivan wasn't the only criminal doing this, and Oregon wasn't the only place where it was happening. It was a practice common in every corner of the world at the time. But on most voyages, the crew of the Peter Iredale was made up of only a small handful of trained professional sailors, and then several unwilling deckhands. Mr. Peter Iredale died in 1899 at the age of 76, but the ship would go on sailing between her usual ports in England and Oregon, picking up cargo all around the world along the way. At some point after his death, as the ownership of the company and the ship may have shifted hands, the vessel's hull was painted a light gray, as we see in later photographs, and of the wreck. On the 26th of September, 1906, the Peter Iredale, under the command of Captain Lawrence, set sail from Salina Cruz, Mexico, carrying no cargo, bound for Portland, Oregon. Normally this journey would take about 30 to 35 days, but Captain Lawrence was offering a bonus to his crew if they could shave 5 days off of this trip. So, the press-ganged crew would not only get a little bit of a perk at the end, but they'd get home 5 days earlier. Naturally, the Peter Iredale was racing along. She had on board a crew of 25 men, plus 2 stowaways who had snuck on board bound for the United States, had been caught and pressed into service with the crew. I mean, you guys could have signed up, the crew totally would have taken you on, but now you're not getting paid. 28 days later, in the darkness of the night, the ship was navigating using dead reckoning, using the various light signals along the shore as waypoints. At 3:20 a.m., the Tillamook Lighthouse was spotted. Shortly after, the Columbia River lightship was spotted as well, and the Peter Iredale adjusted its heading for it. An hour or so passed as the bark made its way in the direction of the lightship, but a strong sea mist rolled in, which combined with the dark night severely limited the crew's visibility.
The problem with the Pacific coast is what they call a lee shore, where predominant winds are constantly blowing toward the shore. So if a sailing vessel in particular gets too close, it's difficult to maneuver away safely.
Winds were picking up, blowing in the direction of the shore. Now, to play it safe, the crew of the Peter Iredale intended to drop their sails and wait offshore before entering the harbor until daylight. But before they could do so, they were carried by the wind and thrown ashore. The Peter Iredale struck the sands of Clatsop Beach, and the shock of the first impact broke the ship's upper masts. The next strike took down more of the mast and some of the spars, disabling the vessel entirely and digging it into the sand. The Peter Iredale, in the middle of a fierce windstorm and dark early morning, was now fast in the sand of Clatsop Beach, about 4 miles south of the mouth of the Columbia River. The crew began firing off distress rockets, and nearby life-saving stations promptly responded. Through the raging surf, boats rowed to and from the stranded ship, pulling her crew off. By now it was daylight, and the last men to leave the vessel were Captain Lawrence and First Mate Clayton. Captain Lawrence staggered ashore, carrying the ship's logbook, a sextant, no doubt an expensive personal possession, and a jug of whiskey. While he sat the whiskey down in the sand, thanked his rescuers, and turned back to the ship. Solemnly, and with great dignity, Captain Lawrence stood upright, saluted the ship, and gave it a toast. "May God bless you, and may your bones bleach in the sand." He took a drink, passed it around to his crew and his rescuers, and then afterwards they were taken to the nearby Fort Stevens, a military fort that dates back to the American Civil War, where they rested and were treated. From there they took the short train ride into the city of Astoria, where the officers of the ship were held by the British overseas authorities until an inquiry could be conducted. Even in the early stages of the inquiry into the wreck, it was clear that no fault would be found, and eventually the crew were exonerated. While the court convened, however, there were unsuccessful attempts to salvage the Peter Iredale, but every tide and storm dug the ship in further. The ship initially sat in a position where her bow pointed towards the dunes, but as the tides rose and fell, the winds continued to buffet her hull, and she was turned and twisted into a parallel position and broke her keel. Now there was no hope of removing the unfortunate vessel. Funny enough, only 19 days after the grounding of the Peter Iredale, another British bark, the Galena, came ashore on the coast of Oregon, only a couple miles south of the Peter Iredale site. With a touch of gallows humor, Captain Lawrence of the Peter Iredale came to visit the wreck of the Galena, while the Galena's captain and mate were standing watch to prevent looting of the wreck, and the three of them posed for a photograph at the helm. Two captains who both wrecked their ship within weeks of each other on nearly the same beach. Well done, lads. Eventually, Peter Iredale's crew went home, and the rights to salvage the ship were sold off. But the ship was never fully dismantled. Instead, just as Captain Lawrence toasted, the ship would sit and bleach in the sands. Various fixtures from the ship were recovered, however, and are now currently held in the collection of the Columbia River Maritime Museum in Astoria, Oregon.
These are the pieces from the Peter Iredale that we have on display. There's the compass binnacle here with the large compensators. Up here we have one of the bells that says Peter Iredale.
The ship's bell used to ring out the start and end of a crew watch.
Those two name boards came off of the ship's boats. All of these vessels had small boats on deck that were used for commuting back and forth from the ship to shore or for emergency lifeboat use, but these would have been on the captain's gig or some other service boat on board. Builder's plate there, it says Ritson and Company, Maryport. That was usually mounted on one of the masts.
In the warehouse, the museum has a salvaged iron cooking pot that, when it was salvaged from the wreck, still had food in it. Dried out and inedible, but food nonetheless. Interestingly enough, the bones of the Peter Iredale lie not terribly far from her old fleetmate, the Ada Iredale. The Ada was a smaller, earlier vessel of the Peter Iredale Company, and in 1876 was crossing the Pacific with a cargo of coal. The coal ignited, causing a smoldering fire to spread throughout the ship, and ultimately the crew abandoned her, letting her go off adrift. Well, a full 8 months later, the Ada Iredale was found, still afloat and still burning. She was towed to port and left to sit and burn herself out, finally being extinguished a full 2 years after the initial flames. The ship was repaired and renamed the Annie Johnson under new owners, and then sold again and renamed the Britannia. It was in 1929, when the wreck of the Peter Iredale was already decrepit in the sands of Clatsop Beach, that the Britannia, the former fleetmate of the Peter Iredale, was sailing the same waters off the coast of Oregon and had to be abandoned. The captain, his family, and the crew were all rescued. It actually seems pretty common that on Clatsop Beach people would take their cars out. We see that today, and I saw that a lot while I was filming. But even back then, people were driving their cars or going out there with horse-drawn carriages right onto the sands of the beach and right up to the wreckage. Between 1929 and 1942, the Peter Iredale continued to be a fun tourist site. However, in June of that year, the wreckage was caught up in a rather unique battle. World War II had begun for America only a few months prior, and the Japanese submarine I-25 had been lurking off the American west coast when it surfaced on June 21st, firing shots on the nearby Fort Stevens. Nobody was hurt, although I understand the nearby baseball field suffered minor damage. However, it has been said that shots from the Japanese flew right over the wreck of the Peter Iredale. I'm a little skeptical about that because it's not exactly in the line of fire from where the Japanese submarine was, but it's a local legend. The attack from the I-25, as well as the Japanese invasion of the Aleutian Islands off Alaska the same month, caused a panic on the west coast that the Japanese may invade. Barbed wire was strung along parts of the coast, including on Clatsop Beach, encasing the wreck of the Peter Iredale in barbed wire. As the war went on, metal was removed from the hull to scrap for the war effort. But in 1945, when the war ended, the barbed wire was removed and she became a popular destination once more. The bowsprit stood prominently from the bow of the wreck until 1961 when it collapsed, one of the final bits of the wreck that showed that she was once a proud sailing bark. A piece of the bowsprit is in the back room collection of the Columbia River Maritime Museum. Her popularity hardly faded, even though the ship itself did. I have here a small collection of some of the countless postcards that were printed of her over the years. The ones that still show the bowsprit on the front would probably date to before 1961 when that bowsprit fell off. Unless they just printed an old photograph, who knows. The bow of the ship remains, deteriorated down to the framing. If we were able to pull back the sand, we would see much of the keel and the base of each mast still in place. When we came to film her, my friend Amos took me on a tour of the wreck and what he remembers changing over the time he's visited since he was a kid.
Up there is the two remaining pieces of wood right in front of that hatch cover that's open. It's the only wood that's left on the ship. If I remember correctly, it was up until the late 80s, early 90s, one of the forward masts was still on the beach and planted into the sand. That's long since gone. I don't know if it washed away or if it was salvaged or what.
Hey, show us the crow's nest access.
Oh yeah, the crow's nest access. It's the only piece of mast that's left that I know of that's not buried. You can see the access door, and you can see a little bit up here towards the sand. I'm not sure if that's a second to access or if it's just part of it broke off and washed away.
The hollow steel masts collect seawater with each tide, occasionally trapping sea life inside until they're freed by the next high water.
The cool thing is you can see just how long the ship was too, because the rudder block's still in place.
If we look at the wreck from above, we can still discern the shape of the ship and how she once sat, based on the position of her masts relative to where the rudder and the bow still are. The rudder post, a practically unrecognizable structure jutting out of the beach at the far end of the ship, also still stands.
This is all still in really good shape, and it actually matches up with the about width tilt the bow has. And just feel it, Tom, just feel how sturdy this is still. Like it doesn't want to chip, it's just a nice solid block.
Yeah, there's no give. So are we looking at the rudder block on the top of the rudder?
I believe so.
If you look closely at her hull, you can still see the individual rivets that held her together through the roughest of seas, and still keep a few of her seams solid after more than a century. Even today, with so little of the ship remaining, the Peter Iredale is a popular wreck, and one of the most iconic visible wrecks in the United States.
By virtue of the fact that it's in a state park and it's easily accessible by a large group of people, makes it a popular spot to stop. I mean, everybody has to get their picture taken in front of the wreck of the Peter Iredale.
The Peter Iredale has established a lasting local legacy. In the nearby town of Warrenton is the Iredale Inn, complete with a painting of the ship over the doorway. Fort George Brewery in Astoria, Oregon even has a beer in tribute to this old ship. May God bless you, and may your bones bleach in the sand. The Peter Iredale has sat for nearly 120 years, crumbling slowly into the sand and sea. She's witnessed over 40,000 sunsets since running aground here on Clatsop Beach, and hundreds of thousands of visitors. Visitors who knew little, if any, about the history of this once proud sailing ship. An information plaque stands in the nearby parking lot, but few take the time to read it. If you have interest and will travel, it's worth the trip up to the wreck of Peter Iredale in northern Oregon, taking in the rich history along the way, and stopping in the incredible Columbia River Maritime Museum, touring their shipwreck gallery, among other exhibits. The museum was gracious enough to allow me to come in and film this and several more upcoming videos on wrecks of the Oregon coast. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to my channel and turning on post notifications to be updated when a new video like this is uploaded. A special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Trent Greger, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Tucker, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Musella, Zolt Bognar, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Jakob Martin Hansen, Stephen Schwankert, Rob, Oliver Chin Chen, Jahala, John Miluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, and